Good afternoon and welcome to the University of Leicester. My name is Henrietta O'Connor and I'm the PVC and Head of the College of Social Science, Arts and Humanities. I'm delighted to have been asked to introduce Professor Phil Almond's inaugural lecture this afternoon and to welcome you all. A benefit of being virtual is that people are able to attend wherever they are, and it's a pleasure to see so many of you have logged in. Inaugural lectures are also an opportunity for the speaker to bring together people from their professional and private life. Today is no exception to this, and I'd particularly like to welcome Phil's parents, Linda and Steve. Today's event is an important part of the university's centenary celebrations, and it's one of the first inaugural lectures in a series from our college. October the 4th was the 100th birthday of the University of Leicester. 100 years ago marked the start of our story and legacy as a university to honour those who made sacrifices during the Great War. Thank you for joining us to mark this historic milestone and to celebrate this new chapter in Professor Almond's career. Having said that, Phil was actually promoted to chair and joined Leicester some time ago, but the pandemic has of course delayed many events and this inaugural is no exception. It's wonderful to finally be able to formally celebrate Phil's career in this way. Phil joined Leicester in June 2018 from Loughborough University, having previously worked at De Montfort and at the University of Manchester, and having had a short spell at Leicester earlier in his career. I've known Phil for around 15 years, but I don't actually know very much about him. I asked people who know him what they would say about him, and the message came back loud and clear. He's an extremely modest and unassuming person. Many academics are very keen to self-promote, and Phil is the opposite of this. He quietly gets on with his research, which is absolutely world-leading, and he plays a quiet yet extremely supportive role in his work and in his school. He never shouts about what he does and what he's achieved, but his CV speaks for itself. He's an outstanding academic, and we're lucky to have him here at Leicester. I also asked Phil if he'd like me to share any elements of his journey to professor, and again his response was typically low-key. He described himself as not that great as an undergraduate, but explained that the year he spent in Belgium as an Erasmus student at Liège was fundamental in making him see things from the outside. He also said there's a certain irony in the fact that he initially studied international business and modern languages as an Aston undergraduate, mainly in an attempt to study something with more career options than just doing a language. We're going to hear much more today on how Phil's career has developed since then. And I'm going to hand over now to Professor Dan Ladley from the School of Business to add to my introduction and to give you an idea of Phil's academic expertise. Thank you.
Thank you, Henrietta. I'm Professor Dan Ladley from School of Business, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this inaugural lecture on behalf of the school, University of Leicester School of Business. It's also a great pleasure to welcome and introduce Phil's lecture. Unlike Henrietta, I haven't known Phil for as long. I remember being part of the panel and the group that appointed him 3 years ago. So it's a great pleasure to welcome him and to start off this lecture for him. So today Phil's going to be giving a lecture entitled Liquid Multinationals, Work, Organisation and Societal Impact. In this lecture, he's going to explore how the management and organisation of increasingly liquid multinationals and how this reflects on the challenges these pose for managers, workers and society, as well as for researchers. As Henrietta said, Phil joined us in 2018 from Loughborough University. He joined us as a Professor of International Management, but his research expertise is much broader than this, taking both international management, human resource management, and work and employment more broadly. Most of his research focuses on multinational companies, examining both the changing nature, global management, and the ways in which the disruptions to national and local business systems caused by corporate globalization shape the decisions of managers, to social actors, and policymakers. He's heavily involved in international collaborations. I was looking at his CV and I can see that he works actively in projects with the Korean National Research Foundation, with the ESRC, and the SSHRC. He works with colleagues from Loughborough, the University of East Anglia, Seoul National University, and the University of Montreal, amongst many others. In a sense, he's one of our most internationally networked academics. One of his most notable projects in recent years is the lead member of the CRIM T project, which is a leading international research partnership looking at globalization on work. He's active in his academic community as well. He sits on the editorial board of key journals such as the International Journal of Human Resource Management and is an advisor to the European Foundation for the Improvement of Living and Working Conditions. Within the school, Phil has made a very large impact. He led and shepherded through our submission to the recent Research Excellence Framework, and in doing so provides a vital contribution to the school. More locally, he provides his expertise, he provides research leadership and mentorship within the school in his area, and his contribution can't be overstated. So it's with great pleasure I'd like to hand over to Phil to start his lecture. Thank you.
Hello. Hello all. Thank you for taking the time to listen to my inaugural lecture. And while I'll doubtless be relieved that in the Teams format I can't point to them in the audience, I'm particularly pleased to welcome my parents, Linda and Steve, who've always supported and encouraged me throughout my life and career. I hope you like the fashionable outfit I've taken to wearing. I'll now hopefully go over to my slides. So the title of this lecture, as you can hopefully see soon, is Liquid Multinationals, Work, Organisation and Societal Impact. I'll note before I start that the title slide was kindly provided by the university's events team. For the rest of the slides, the process of preparing this lecture has made me bitterly regret the fact that I don't research the moons of Saturn or impressive looking dinosaurs or something. So the arguments of this lecture come from mainly from work on an ESRC funded project called Globalizing Actors in Multinational Companies, the Creation, Diffusion and Implementation and Contestation of Global Norms, a long title, which has been at the centre of my research efforts in the last few years. I'm not going to be able to name check everyone who's helped me in my career, because if I did, there wouldn't be much time for anything else. But my work on this project is as part of a team led by Professor Tony Edwards of Loughborough University, London, and also including Professors Olga Tragaskis and Kevin Daniels of the University of East Anglia. And I've also worked closely with two of the researchers, Philip Kern and Kyungmi Kim, as well as with teams at the University of Montreal, led by Professor Gregor Murray, of whom more later, and Seoul National University, led by Dr. Hyunji Kwan. It's also worth saying that this project ran from 2016 to the beginning of 2020, but has its genesis as far back as 2011. So as most of the academics among you will know, research of this kind is very far from being a fast process. So my core argument here in this lecture is that contemporary multinational companies are tending towards more fluid or liquid forms of organization. This, I'm going to argue, has the unfortunate side effect for people like me of making multinationals more difficult to research. It becomes harder to follow how they make rules across different geographies and different organizational units, as the ways in which norms are transmitted across multinationals become more diverse and sometimes hard to locate. Before I do that, though, having gone one step too far in the presentation, before I do that, though, I'm going to try and make some kind of sense of where my research comes from in general. So, as was reflected in the introductions, looking back across my career, an astute reader of my CV would note that the direction of my academic ambitions has not been entirely consistent across my career. So I was a lecturer in human resource management. In terms of job titles, I was a lecturer in human resource management and organizational behavior at De Montfort, then a lecturer in employment studies at the old Centre for Labour Market Studies at Leicester, then a reader in international and comparative human resource management, then professor of comparative employment relations at De Montfort, before my long-term collaborator and friend Tony Edwards at Loughborough University, London, put a stop to all that nonsense and gave me the beautifully vague title of Professor of International Management, which I quite deliberately kept on returning to Leicester. For any early career academics watching this is probably not an ideal career plan given academia's organisation into disciplinary associations and organisations. Partly this probably reflects a slightly contrarian nature and also reflects the fact that I'm not much of a joiner. But it also reflects the fact that the world out there does not conveniently organise itself into academic categories. So I think it's probably useful to write out in longhand what I think I'm a professor of. So the underlying goal of my research is to understand how ideas about work, employment and management are diffused and contested across geographical borders from an international comparative perspective. This goes back at least as far as my doctoral work, supervised by the incomparable Professor Jill Rubery, which almost certainly overambitiously attempted to compare the theory and practice of human resource management in the UK and France. I have borrowed liberally and continue to borrow on concepts from industrial relations, sociology, political economy, and economic geography in order to try and advance such an understanding. This, along with its extremely supportive environment and its desire to use academic research to change the world of work for the better, is probably why my external academic relations have been concentrated in the crimped network, which in turn explains to my family why I have spent so much time in Montreal. But also, if you were to ask how I think I have made any progress in this underlying goal, a lot of it has been through the highly sophisticated method known as talking and listening to people, including managers, workers, trade unionists and policymakers of various kinds across various projects. My first research interview was in 1995 at Peugeot's now long abandoned car plant in Coventry. I don't think it was very good. And I hesitate to speculate on the number of research interviews that I must have conducted since then, either alone or more usually with colleagues. The overall number is certainly several hundred across France, Ireland, Spain, the USA, Canada, and South Korea, as well as the UK. As you will see in a few minutes, some of these interviews or conversations have left a strong impression on me. Some, it has to be admitted, mainly for their bathos. One can include in this category interviewing telecom engineers as a doctoral research assistant at UMIST, using the novel approach of shouting our list of standardized questions to men who were probably understandably more concerned with remaining attached to the telegraph pole that they were on top of at the time. In somewhat more luxurious surroundings, an initial conversation through a student interpreter with senior executives of a large Korean multinational, in which I mainly tried to focus on trying to work out how to eat seafood with metal chopsticks while being grilled on Brexit by Korean captains of industry, was also memorable. I don't know if he's in the audience, but it's almost equally hard to forget an interview some 20 years ago with my colleague and friend Trevor Colling in a UK factory of a large American industrial multinational with a team leader driven to insanity by the US management's insistence that in order to comply with the operational requirement for all equipment to be standardized across the world, rubber hoses could only be of one particular length, even if that meant that it was impossible for them to actually function. Also say that talking and listening to people extends beyond, for research purposes, extends beyond the formal interview setting. And as a comparativist, I'm strongly of the view, and because I've written on this, that time spent in the society in which you're trying to make science about is close to a necessity. People do sometimes say these things as a joke, but I'm not joking when I say I heard better explanations of the American internal labour market in large firms and of competition between French trade unions, among other things, talking to people in hotel bars than I did through more formal means. And now, with those intellectual and methodological contexts in mind, I'm finally going to talk about multinationals. So, just as a basic definition, a multinational company is any company which directly employs people in providing its goods or services in more than one country. It's worth saying in passing that not all multinationals are massive corporations. I think the smallest multinational that I've visited for research employed a total of 12 people worldwide. And I've also visited one UK subsidiary of a German firm not very far from Leicester, which employed just 3 people in the UK. Among those that study international business as a vocation, the idea of small entrepreneurial firms being born global is an important current area of research. However, I guess most people will think by default of the giant global companies, depending on age and where you're from. Your default image of the multinational company might be Ford or IBM, McDonald's, or more recently companies like Amazon. Multinationals are, of course, one of the more visible manifestations of economic globalization. So I'm 49 years old. Over my adult lifetime, the reach of multinationals has expanded considerably. So notwithstanding recent political nationalism, free trade areas such as the EU or in North America, NAFTA, have eased cross-border investment, whether for new greenfield investment, where a foreign company buys a factory or facility overseas, such as Toyota near Derby in the 1990s, which still employs about 3,000 people. There's also brownfield investment through mergers and takeovers. Brownfield investment is particularly prominent in the UK due to the enthusiasm of our country's political embrace of privatisation and liberalisation. For example, were this a physical lecture, many of you would have travelled to Leicester on the East Midlands Railway, which is run by Abellio. Abellio is owned by the Dutch national rail operator, which, perhaps slightly ironically, remains run by the Dutch state. To add to that, you might then have travelled on an Arriva bus, which is ultimately owned by the Federal Republic of Germany. So one of the many contradictions of British capitalism is how many of its utilities are owned by the state, just not the British state. Thinking on a more global level, again in my adult lifetime, the internationalization of Asian economies, particularly China and India, as well as the collapse of the Soviet bloc, opened up new potential places of production for firms with global reach. Initially, and perhaps still in the public imagination, this was the offshoring of production that might once have taken place in the advanced Western economies. But more recently, China and India have also become substantial sources of foreign direct investment through the foreign expansion of their own firms. So there now remain very few parts of the world where multinationals are not significant employers. So what does all this mean for, I guess, my core research interest of the management of work? First, I think a lot of the historic interest in what multinationals were doing among employment relations academics came because, particularly in Europe, multinationals were seen sources of global pressures on employment practices in host countries. And certainly they play a crucial role in the internationalization of management ideas. So taking ideas that were developed in one country and converting them into employment practice elsewhere. This is not, perhaps fortunately for my career, this is not a frictionless process. So there's a large volume of management research on how attempts at creating uniform global policies sometimes encounters difficulties. So to give two fairly simple examples, it is difficult legally for large firms to operate on a non-union basis in parts of Western Europe. And it's often stated that Chinese managers and workers, amongst others, resist American-style individual performance management. The ability to develop global norms, though, and to manage the tension between the advantages of standardizing norms across countries in terms of having uniform culture across a global company and in reducing the costs of running management systems, and the advantages, on the other hand, of adaptation to local context is widely seen as crucial to multinationals' competitive advantage. So I originally came to the city of Leicester 21 years ago to research with my old boss and mentor, Anthony Ferner, how American multinationals managed employment relations in European countries. This research focused on how American firms internationalized using ideas about management that originated in the American business system, what Anthony and now everyone else refers to as country of origin effects. This research, importantly for what follows in this presentation, saw the transfer of policies, so for instance, of performance management, career development, work organization, industrial relations, as at least partly subject to the organizational politics of multinationals. So rather than things being transferred or not transferred on a mechanical basis, they are the result of various contests of power between managers and workers, sometimes between headquarters and subsidiary managers of different units, and sometimes to an extent between the managers and owners of firms, which shaped what policies were transferred and how they were transferred in practice. So one way in which multinationals are a source of global pressures on employment practices is through the fact that they may choose to integrate policies across the world. We should say in passing, although it's not the focus here, the multinationals also segment between operations in different places. So we shouldn't ignore the fact that that American and European multinationals located in poorer parts of the world often are often not seeking to transfer the positive elements of their human resource practice. Secondly, multinationals are sources of global pressures on employment practices because they usually have at least some degree of ability to locate their production or service provision in places where the political and economic regime is favourable to their interests. So the old choice of picture here, a bard reflects Jack Welch, once the sort of bête noire of all progressives who are interested in work and employment. When CEO of General Electric, once famously said, ideally you'd have every plant you own on a barge to move with currency fluctuations and with changes in the economy. So multinationals who have choices about where they might invest are not necessarily very strongly embedded in local economies, as they may want to preserve that locational flexibility. Slightly more specifically, at one stage of the Brexit debacle, the CEO of Airbus, for which the British subsidiary manufactures the wings of Airbuses, of airlines, was quoted as saying, "Of course, it's not possible to pick up and move our large UK factories to other parts of the world immediately. However, aerospace is a long-term business and we could be forced to redirect future investments in the event of a no-deal Brexit. And make no mistake," the kind of threat at the end of this, "there are plenty of countries out there who would love to build the wings for Airbus aircraft." And of course, that's true, given that a company such as Airbus directly and indirectly supports thousands of relatively well-paid and generally relatively secure jobs. Industrial relations research on multinationals often reports senior managers making what are referred to as coercive comparisons, in which productivity, or maybe terms in a collective agreement, in one host country are unfavorably compared to those somewhere else. So where firms locate according to their preferences about regulation, this is referred to in the industrial relations literature, at least, as regime shopping. So around a decade ago, in an international project, again with Anthony Ferner and Olga Tragaskis in the UK, and international colleagues led by Gregor Murray, Maria Gonzalez, and Paddy Gunnigal, we looked at how subnational regions competed for foreign direct investment across England, Canada, Spain, and Ireland, with very substantial effort made on the part of the public realm, substantial public money spent on attempts to attract and retain specific inward investors. Now, this research had aims somewhat outside the scope of the current lecture, but one sort of practical take-home message from it is worth remembering. It's vital that anyone trying to understand human resource management, employment, work in units of multinationals, it's vital that they also understand the unit's business context. You simply cannot understand what's going on in a local factory or office of a multinational without understanding what it is doing, what that multinational is doing in a particular place. Whether there are sister plants doing the same thing elsewhere, and whether the unit has or can develop some form of international mandates, be a global or European centre of excellence in something. In other words, the first question that you need to ask yourself before any of your clever research questions is, why is this here? And I think you tend to find that if there isn't a good reason for why, if you can't find yourself a good reason as to why this is here, it often doesn't stay wherever here is very long. So in summary of, I guess, where we got to before the current project, a large volume of international human resource management research has focused on policy transfer in multinationals. This has made considerable progress in understanding the globalization of human resources, contextualizing the cross-national transfer of practices and of control mechanisms. The focus of this literature, as as our earlier research was, is generally on the national subsidiary, so on IBM UK, and on the transfer of formal HR policies. Now, it's certainly true that attempts at coordination and control may happen through formal policies, which is what the international HR literature still focuses on, but that's missing a whole load of human resource work and employment-related action, in the sense that attempts at making rules, attempts at making norms also occur through a whole range of other mechanisms. So the focus on, by the time we started the research I'm going to talk about in more detail in a moment, I think we were coming to the point where we were thinking that this focus on formal home-to-host transfer fails to provide a total picture or convincing picture of the organisation of multinationals for two main reasons. First, the integration of multinationals doesn't only occur through the transfer of formal policies, but also through a range of normative control mechanisms which are commonly less formal in nature. So if you're a powerful senior manager of a global firm, there are ways in which you can affect what happens other than written HR policies. Second, and perhaps more importantly here, the literature on transfer tends to assume that national subsidiaries are the central organising structures within the firm through which potential global policies have to travel. This plays down or ignores the fact that many firms don't really operate like that. They operate in international network structures with multiple business units and multiple business and organizational projects, which are not primarily organized around national subsidiaries. Equally, as I'll come on to in more detail in a minute, real-time collaboration across borders is in many firms not a rare thing. It's an everyday fact of working life. It's what people do for a living. These routinized operational interactions across borders mean that an increasingly wide pool of staff have significant international interactions. So a really substantial number of both managers, but also team leaders and other professionals have some degree of authority over staff not based in their own country of work, meaning that if we want to talk about international management within multinationals, we need to look at a whole lot of people. They're not particularly easy to find. Indeed, a substantial part of a research project was trying to work out actually who they are. So an important part of our argument is that looking only at formal HR policies and at national subsidiary to headquarters relations, which again is what the international HR literature generally does, doesn't capture very well how work is coordinated and controlled in international firms today. So somewhat unscientifically, as I say, some research interviews stick with me, and those who've heard me present in the last couple of years will know that this one has particularly stuck with me. This is the example of Kate, which is not her real name, who we interviewed in 2019. So it's in the context, it's useful to bear in mind that this is well before COVID and lockdowns, etc. So Kate worked from home in Atlanta, Georgia, in the United States, for an IT services division of a large UK multinational in telecommunications and electronics. So she was an IT professional with some management experience. She'd worked in the same company, in the same British company in the US for 22 years, so quite long service, what might not immediately appear to be very liquid. A few years ago, the company introduced, as companies or as large companies want to do, a global requirement for 10% labour efficiency savings year on year. And so, as she said, I was doing design and development, and I was not in one of the three places in which design and development took place in this company. So I needed to find another job. She was fortunate enough to find another job with the same employer, and at the time of the interview, she led a team on a specific contract, a large contract, providing standardized voice and internet services to a large Dutch multinational. And this follows some of these contracts and projects follow an interesting pattern of contracting. And so in this case, powerful people in Kate's working life, the contract directors for both firms, were based in the Netherlands. So not only was the client firm based in the Netherlands, but also the British multinational, in order to service this large contract, also had a contract director in the Netherlands, and obviously operating under Dutch law, etc. Kate's job existed because the Dutch multinational involved had a regional headquarters in Atlanta. At the time of the interview, Kate managed a team, or a small team of 11 people, so a fairly junior manager. This was management of their actual work, so management of the actual labour process. Two of these were in Atlanta, three in a service centre in Colombia, and 5 in a service centre in India. While she isn't their only line manager, so the Colombians would have line managers in Colombia, etc., she does input into their performance reviews, which are very important in this company. She visits the office of the not of her multinational, but of the Dutch multinational in Atlanta once a week, but otherwise worked entirely from home. So she's never been to Colombia, she's never been to India, has never met the people that she is managing, who are also obviously work in countries with different cultures, different institutions, etc. So you might think, the more naive of you, that this would mean that the British company involved might think, well, this is a fairly complicated thing for someone to be doing. It's obviously, I think, obviously more difficult as a relatively junior manager to be managing a relatively small team across 3 continents and different time zones, many of whom for which English will not be a first language, than it would be to manage a local workforce in Atlanta. You might think this will be a thing for which considerable training would be provided, but of course you'd be wrong. So there isn't there is not a manual for virtual global management, and we found this repeatedly with people who had somewhat similar roles or somewhat similar careers. When you ask them, have you had any training for this role, they would say, maybe there's some resources on the intranet, but I've not really looked because I'm too busy. It's important, again, to notice the importance of the Dutch client in controlling what's going on. So the operating company for the Dutch client were very specific about what was being done. This is, although the work sounds and is technological, a lot of it involves who moves what within buildings when telephony services are being employed. So they were very specific about that. Very specific about the fact that the Indian employees couldn't contact the local clients, despite the fact that Indian IT operatives essentially instruct the local field engineers across the Americas. So what you see going on here is continual renegotiation involving fairly junior organizational members of complex contracts for business services affecting basic work organization, while also having to appear to comply with norms on the part of the British company, such as their, and this is quite a common sort of thing, such as their insistence that 70% of each product or service in this case is globally uniform, no more than 30% tailored to the client. So company-wide norms in terms of HR, in terms of performance management, and basic work organization were continually enacted, supplemented, or replaced at a very local, global local level. Now, in some ways, managers such as Kate had much more autonomy than would have been the case in the American multinationals in the UK and Europe that we researched 20 years ago. But what we're seeing is they're having to work many more things out quickly. So the continual international sort of organizational experimentation at these very, very micro levels, as well as individuals having to work on managing their careers within and around these the multinationals that are increasingly fluid in how they organize things. So what we're saying is that the diffusion of these of organizational practices and norms across our multinationals that affect how people are managed is not only, and is probably not even mainly, about the transfer of managers. So the population of what we call globalizing actors, which are the people that we were researching, people involved in the creation, implementation, diffusion of global norms, is really very much larger, is much less elite, and is much more variegated than the population of international managers. And this is reflected in the idea of liquid comes originally from Bauman's ideas in sociology about liquid society. This is not very strongly reflected in the management and organizational literature, but there is some which are represented there on the increasing project-based nature of much of employment and much of what you experience as an employee in terms of management. So coordination isn't just about big policies, it's also about people finding ways of finding fast solutions to coordination problems, in which the central bureaucracies, the central administrators of international hierarchy are not able to account for fully. They'll often not even really know what people or what whole units are actually doing. So at least in some sectors, global work has been routinized, but generally without training and without recognition. This poses questions that we won't have time to talk a lot about here, but questions of competence and capabilities, and questions of professional and occupational identity. It also poses questions for the geography of the workplace, the idea of a local office or a local factory floor being replaced by a virtual landscape, which I guess we're all slightly more familiar with now, in which the local completion of the reward in work, between effort and reward, occurs in a disembodied way, mediated by ICT platforms. So we need a view of the multinational in research that emphasizes the fluidity of structures and multiple forms of collaboration and contestation through a range of formal and informal channels of cross-national interaction. So this contrasts with the more stable and hierarchical relationship between geographically based entities the reliance on subsidiaries in a lot of research creates. So we argue here that we need to follow the story and be wary of preconceived views of what these interactions may look like. So in reality, I've already been talking about this project for some time, but in terms of its goals, the Globalizing Actors ESSC project analyzes the roles of individuals in the international integration of multinational corporations. It asks how these globalizing actors spread, implement, and contest norms across international operations. So globalizing actors are individuals with authority over others in norm creating or enactment processes on an international basis. As we've said, and I won't go too far down this territory because Tony Edwards is currently writing about it, a lot of these are not standard global managers. They're either the sort of people that Kate was, managers of virtual teams, or they were people that had fallen into working on an international basis as part of projects, or sometimes just to try and get their work better organized to cover for failures of management to actually organize work. So we define globalizing actors as individuals with authority over others in norm-making processes at international levels. I should say what we mean by a norm, which is somewhat, I think, different to what some social scientists would generally see as a norm. So we're looking at ideas and standards of appropriate behavior, which have some degree of governing force concerning the nature of work. So if you ignore the nature of work bit for a minute, it's a norm for us is anything where you're where someone in authority or someone with power says you must do this, you shouldn't do that, it is good to do this, it would be a bad idea to do that, etc. And so if you think about it for a minute, norms obviously can take the form of codified rules with explicit rewards and sanctions for particular actions. You will be fined if you go into the supermarket without wearing a mask. Or statements, principles, guidelines, or enunciated ideas which shape practices by providing frames of reference. So maybe we're not sure, but perhaps you should wear a mask in the supermarket. For us, these include HR policies, but also relatively informal cooperation of work groups, things that like framework policies, sorts of things that multinationals set out in value statements as they're targeted at employees, and specific global initiatives. So essentially, and for both time and concentration reasons, I'm not going to go too deeply into this, but what we're trying to do is, the bet that we've taken in this research really is to try to integrate the analysis of different forms of global norm making relating to work. So rather than treat HR policies in one category and ignore everything else, or look only at informal things on the work on the work floor, we're trying, at least theoretically, to come up with something that can cover the variety of processes of international norm making that happen in multinationals. So we then try to identify dimensions of these norm making processes, and we come up with 4, 2 of which relate to substance and 2 of which relate to process. So first we look at codification. So where a norm is highly codified, the ways in which it's intended to affect behaviours and choices of people is clearly expressed in a way that's intended to minimize ambiguity. So you think of the sort of norms that air traffic controllers would follow, they obviously have to be highly codified to avoid misunderstanding. While multinationals may try to codify precisely what needs to be done to achieve a particular performance target, for example, we don't assume that this is always the case. Some norms, even those designed by powerful people who could make policy, are intentionally vague in their codification. We can think of things like statements of organizational values, which are clearly intended to affect people's behaviors, but provide more of a framework within which employees attempt to illustrate how their behaviors comply with organizational norms, rather than providing precise instructions to follow in all circumstances. So informality here is often intentional on the part of powerful actors. Second, to succeed in governing behaviours, a norm requires some sort of enforcement. So a norm without any enforcement at all is just an idea. Enforcement we can see as more formal when the consequences of obeying or disobeying are clear. So you'll get fired if you do something unacceptable, or you'll receive a certain bonus if you do a specific thing. And obviously, enforcement can be seen as less formal when the consequences are unclear. And this happens all the time in organisations. You know that doing certain things will meet with approval or will meet with disapproval, but you don't know the precise consequences of this. It's worth again saying that informality does not always mean, of enforcement, does not always mean weakness. So informality and the sanctions for not complying with certain norms can be very effective from senior managers' viewpoints. The notion that something good or something seriously bad will happen can be much more effective than specifying exactly what. We then look at things to do with process. The first is what we call platforms, the organizational platform through which the norm is promoted. Within large multinationals, the platforms that we know most about are the orthodox organizational structures like national and regional hierarchies or support functions such as international HR functions. These administrative bureaucratic platforms reduce uncertainty and provide some degree of clarity to people. However, they may lack flexibility and they may not always be the fastest way of dealing with emergent issues. So what we see a lot of is senior managers seeking to apply norms through much less structured platforms. These include a whole range of things that are increasingly common in contemporary organizations, even in universities, such as working parties, which in multinationals are likely to be transnational, task forces, the appointment of local champions, often not very senior people who gain much more authority through being local champions outside the standard bureaucratic structures. These remain somewhat formal in the sense that the membership of such groups is generally in the gift of managers with hierarchical authority, but they're often designed as temporary structures and often designed to bypass standard intermediate managers in the hierarchy. So again, fitting with the liquid metaphor. I'm not going to talk about the final one, aggregation, much. This just reflects that norms a norm has to reflect to relate to other norms. So how does a new norm on performance management relate to norms on diversity, for example? So informal processes where, and these are rarely fully thought through, informal processes where actors on the ground, particularly in international, whether in different societal backgrounds, interpret the situation where norms designed for different purposes intersect or collide are inevitable in most cases. All right, and so for the paper we recently had published in Human Resource Management Journal, you have to come up with a table. They tend to prefer a 2x2 matrix. We've got a 2x4 matrix here, but I'm not going to talk through this because I'll run out of time. But clearly, you can see that we are proposing a spectrum rather than a binary of formality or informality across these four dimensions that we come up with. So to conclude, managers are becoming more fluid in their organization. This is not necessarily uniform, and it happens in at different rates in different sectors, but nonetheless it is happening. This means we need to rethink how we analyze them, and in words which we have in another paper, we need to assume less and explore more. So our bet is on trying to identify globalizing actors and on trying to bring together the analysis of different types of norms which shape the nature of work, employment, and management. And we think this is more generalizable to a greater potential range of contexts, and also to substantially different issues. One could look at sustainability or many other things in using that sort of schema for norms. Okay, that was my last slide. The slide may disappear shortly. Finally, so I'm not going to name loads of people, but I would like to thank again my parents, my family and loved ones. I'd like specifically to mention the three main people that have acted as mentors to me in my career. Professors Jill Rubery at Manchester Business School, Anthony Ferner, now retired, and the incomparable Gregor Murray of the University of Montreal, and Crimp's heartfelt thanks to those. I'd also like to thank all the people I've worked with on various research and writing projects, of whom there by now are a great many, and to my fantastic colleagues at Leicester, particularly within the newly revived Centre for Sustainable Work and Employment Futures, CSWEF. Okay, that's the end of my presentation, and I'll hand back over to Henrietta.
Thanks very much, Phil. Thank you very much for your lecture. It was a wonderful insight into your work and a skillful presentation of your research interests and your wide-ranging experience of researching work and employment in different countries and in different organisational contexts. Those who didn't know what you were doing in your international research trips will now have a much better idea. You brought it to life for all of us in a really accessible lecture. The focus on your research participants and the importance of what you termed listening to people's accounts of their own working lives gave us an insight to the human stories that emerge from the sometimes faceless world of multinationals. If we were in normal times, I'd now be able to ask you all to join me in a huge round of applause to thank Phil for a fantastic lecture. So Phil, please take a moment to visualise and imagine a tremendous round of virtual applause from your audience this afternoon. I'd also be able to invite you all for a reception and the opportunity to continue the conversation, and I'm sorry that I can't extend the invitation today. All that remains is for me to thank Phil again on behalf of all of us, and to thank you all for joining us this afternoon. Thank you.